everyone, and welcome to Mental Health for Working Parents, where with other mental health professionals, we talk about various emotional demands of parenting without shame or stigma. And today my guest is Danielle, who is a psychotherapist in the US. Hello.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming. And we're going to talk about parenting through divorce. And we're going to talk about, how to make this demanding and challenging period less traumatic, less challenging, and healthier for the whole families. And obviously children who are also kind of in the middle very often of that challenging transition. And I would just like to open up by sharing some of the numbers that I found. And I know I'm based in Portugal. As I've said, Danielle is in the US, so numbers I found are for Europe. But some of the divorce rates, so Portugal has 91% of divorces, and this is all per 100 of marriages. Spain has 85, Italy has 68, Sweden has 68, Finland has 61. So I'm not going to kind of name all the countries, but the point I'm making, divorce is incredibly common. So a lot of families are affected. So could you just kind of tell us a bit about, your work, your specialization, and just maybe speak about how common is this also, and yeah, what are kind of the main challenges, I guess, people who are going through the divorce are facing?
Sure. Again, my name is Danielle McDowell, and I'm a licensed therapist, and I'm in Virginia, in the United States, but I'm licensed to support individuals in Virginia and Florida. My focus and work is with couples. And so I do a lot of couples work, and in that couples work, I'm supporting individuals on all spectrums of the relationship, including separation. And a lot of times couples don't think about therapy for walking away from the relationship, but it's very helpful to have a third party who has a skill set and an education to help you walk through that process in a healthy way. We tend to think as a society as a whole that divorce is traumatic and as a bad thing. And I like to help couples understand that that is not necessarily the case. There are things that you can do in your relationship as you walk away from the relationship, especially in the capacity of parenting children, so that they can still be whole and they can still be happy and they can still thrive. And those statistics that you just recently shared with the audience demonstrate how common it is now for individuals to be experiencing divorce or know someone very close to them who has experienced divorce. I'm a product of a parent who divorced. My parents divorced when I was really young. So I know firsthand what it was like through the childhood experience. And I know that there are areas that require some work to make it healthy. But with a professional who's licensed, you can get that work done. And so part of the work that I do in the community is I help couples get through that process. I'm also a coach, and so I provide coaching for women in areas of boundaries and figuring out self-esteem, so that skill-based stuff. And a lot of times the themes I see with couples is when they walk away from the relationship, they tend to think that they don't have the capacity to maintain a connection with the partner in a healthy way when the actual intimate relationship has ended. And when the intimate relationship is ended, you have to now form a different type of relationship with the individual who is no longer part of the marriage. And so in therapy, we spend a lot of time working about what does that look like? What is this new normal for our family? And how are we going to navigate this space? And it looks different for everyone, but there's some common themes that I'm sure we'll go over today in our discussion.
Yeah. And I think, I also kind of come from a family where my parents got a divorce where I was like very young. I was 2 years old. So I don't actually explicitly remember that, process of separation because I was very small. So I don't even have access, right, to those memories. And I think it wasn't like until I was, I guess, in my 20s, and then I've started my individual therapy where I was really, started to explore, to kind of digest, to really make sense of the impact and it had on me. Because I think, and that was obviously, it was very different times with obviously less kind of information and support available. But I think that was kind of, I guess, one of the examples of separations where I think there was a lot of trauma potentially for everyone. And I just, just add to what you've said. I just really want to kind of bring in that I think those beliefs that every divorce is trauma really comes from that understanding that we can just kind of label certain things as being traumatic, but really trauma is always an individual interpretation, and at that way we can't really say that every separation, every divorce is going to be traumatic, because it will really depend on the things that you are talking about. It will depend on what kind of support, how do all, I guess, parties manage that. But just going back to my kind of personal experience, so I think it really had an effect on me, growing up, and had an effect on obviously the relationships I was in and I think even like now I notice an effect when I became a parent, on my marriage, on how I raise my children. So it's like I constantly go back to an impact it had. And I just kind of want to ask you, because I think the divorce is obviously kind of a final decision, but normally until the couples make that decision, sometimes there are years and years and years of the relationship that is far from healthy. Is not the word that I like to use, but it's a relationship where there are a lot of emotional challenges. So can you just kind of talk about that, almost a process that happens before divorce, and some of the years where actually couple is getting very distant, there's a lot of conflict usually, and then how to manage that, especially when there are children in the middle of that?
Most definitely. And I think you speak to a point where when we think about divorce as the traumatic experience for young people, some people, the process before divorce was the traumatic space for them, because they witnessed parents fussing, they witnessed the discourse. And it can look different for lots of different couples. So some couples, it's a lot of screaming and yelling. I've worked with couples where it's become physical too, right? And so when we think about that part prior to divorce, that it's this space and time where two individuals have started to realize that we don't coexist very well, right? And I say two individuals because I'm speaking of a traditional couple relationship, and I try to be clear about that because we now live in a society where couples look very different, right? So when I'm speaking in terms currently of traditional coupled relationships, marriages. And so these two individuals have determined that we no longer exist well, and they have probably made some strategies or some attempts of repair, but they're consistently seeing that we can't fix this thing. And if kids are involved during that process, they are accustomed to, even if you're not fussing around your kids, they pick up our energies, right?
Yeah.
And so you cannot be intentionally connecting them to the discourse of the relationship, but unintentionally they understand mom and dad are not talking to each other anymore. They're not sleeping in the same room anymore. We don't sit down and have dinner anymore. And they are noticing these patterns. So when those types of things are starting to happen, that's when you need to be communicating in an age appropriate way with your children about what's going on. A lot of the times it's this intention of we want to leave them out because we don't want them to be hurt. But when you don't have communication with your children, then they start making their own interpretation about what's going on in the relationship. And
Yeah.
many times children look inward and say, I'm the problem. Mommy and daddy are fussing because of me. And so it's
Yeah.
important during that, prior to divorce, during that phase when there's this discourse, that we have communication as a unit in the relationship, but as well as with the children, and an age appropriate. And I keep saying age appropriate because all kids need different information, and you don't have to tell them everything that's going on, to still give them enough information so that they know that this challenge in our relationship does not mean that you have caused it for us. And this is an adult problem that the adults are going to work on and work through. And we just need you to understand that during this time, there will be discourse, but it doesn't mean we don't love you, and it's not your fault, right? So
And yeah, I was just going to say, this I think is something that I see so often, that, a lot of couples or clients who come, they say, we don't argue in front of children, we don't do it in front of children. Children don't actually know. And I think what you're saying is so, significant. Children always feel that there's something that's happening, whether we tell them or not. From the very young age, they have sense. They're really, children don't learn from what we tell them. They really learn from what we do. They can kind of have the senses, and they always sense if something is wrong. So I think this is really something that a lot of couples think, that if we don't talk about this in front of them, we're going to protect them. And I really hear that this is that need to protect children from something that is actually happening, and that conflict, and minimize all, I guess, the potential, harm that can come. But really, very often it does the opposite, as you've said, because, I think there's so much that just internal conflict that can happen as a result of that, where, as you said, children are actually starting to think that it's something that I'm not doing, or maybe I'm not enough, or maybe, I need to try harder, or maybe something I can fix, maybe I can rescue this relationship. And so I just wanted to really kind of pause on that, and to just recognize that this is so, so important. It happens so often. And I think this kind of on its own becomes that part that can potentially have a really big negative impact, that's kind of secrecy around this, and not kind of being inclusive, because it is a family that's being affected all the time with any kind of, with positive or negative changes, right? There's an impact for everyone.
Yeah, and you speak to a good point, because I think historically I've noticed that parents specifically don't want to cause any kind of harm or discomfort to their children. And so if they think the information is going to cause them to be sad, or going to cause them to have difficult feelings, they want to keep that away from them. And I encourage parents to understand that it is not our responsibility to keep them from processing heavy emotions, because when they become adults, they will have to learn how to cope with sadness, with despair, with anger. And so the feelings that come along with understanding that my mom and dad may no longer be together are difficult feelings, yes, but you're giving them space to learn how to process through these difficult feelings, and you're giving them the information and the ability to learn ways to cope through it, because they will experience hurt and despair and anger and all the feelings that come along with when things don't go the way you would like them or desire them to go. And so it is not our responsibility as parents to keep them from feeling particular things, but to help equip them with the ability on how to manage the feelings when they come along.
Yeah. And I think it's also just so, this, I think endings are hard, and, an ending of the relationship is incredibly hard. And, and all of the feelings that you were talking about, they're natural responses, and they have such a big meaning kind of in a integration, right? And how we digest digest all of that. And, and endings are meant to be painful, hard, difficult, that grieving is really part of just being able to kind of digest it in a way that's healthy for our nervous system. And I think you're so right. Sometimes I think we as parents kind of try to make sure that our children are always happy, or they are kind of, every time they seem to be sad, there's always kind of the need to come and to comfort. And especially throughout something that is such a major life transition, I can completely understand that, the need of parents is we just don't want them to be sad. But I think actually allowing them to be sad is really how they can grieve that they has been the end, right? And it's really part of that. It's just acknowledging, recognizing, and being able to stay with that. And I think because very often, as you've said, parents can be really caught up in their own relationship, and obviously every relationship is different. The reasons for the divorce is very, very different. Sometimes it's a decision of one party, sometimes it's not mutual. And can you just talk a little bit of that, where in many divorces, it seems almost like there's no space for having that conscious awareness. Okay, let's just do this uncoupling in a very conscious way. Let's get all the support. Sometimes there is really just a lot of raw emotions, hurt, pain. Sometimes it's infidelity. Sometimes there's a lot of, sometimes it could be violence, as you've said. So there are a lot of things where this dialogue might not be possible.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And well, to start off, I always say, in any relationship, specifically an intimate relationship, all parties have to agree to want to be a part of it. And at any point in time, someone can walk away. And that's the vulnerability of giving your heart to someone in that way and making that commitment that at any time the other party could say, I don't want to do this anymore. And you have to respect that was their choice and move forward. And so individually, if you're struggling with this relationship is ending, and maybe you were the person who wanted it to not end, maybe you think that there was ways to repair, but your partner has said, no, I am done. It is now your responsibility to do your healing work on your own so that you can process what that meant, grieve through that process, and show up for your children, right? Because they are dependent upon your ability to work through this in the healthiest way that you can. Now, when there are couples that have experienced things like domestic violence, there are some caveats to this because we need everyone to be safe. And so the first goal is, how do we maintain safety? And then after we maintain safety, how do we get supports in place for all parties who have witnessed this relationship, this unhealthiness, before it transitioned to divorce? And then how are we now working together to create a more healthier version of a family that looks different than us all collectively living together, right? And so there is a process. It's different for each individual, but the primary responsibility is for all adults to do their work. If they're having a hard time with the relationship ending, then I would encourage you to get some individual therapy and work through those feelings. Who are your natural supports? Do you have a good girlfriend that you can talk to about what this feels like? There's support groups for individuals who are going through divorce. Attend a support group. Find connections with people who have had a similar experience and help work through those feelings, because the more equipped you are to process it, the better you will show up for your children, and you will be able to give them the space to process this end of the relationship in a healthier way. And so it's the responsibility of the grown-up to do their work, to work through the end of the relationship.
And I think this is so, so important because I see so many cases and, just going back to my own personal experience, where children kind of really become that, that in the middle, there's this kind of triangulation, right? That kind of happens where the divorce really becomes not in between only parents, but in between kind of children, where they're becoming active participants of this whole process, because there are kind of messages that are sent when, for example, parents are not able to communicate, and then there are all this kind of messages that children are receiving, and then they're passing them, and then I think this is really a big part of that deep work, is just being able to exclude kind of children from that active divorcing, where they really don't feel like they need to have any of that responsibility, right? Because it's impossible. It's impossible for a child, no matter how old they are, right? Because sometimes I think can be another polarity. Oh, they understand everything. They understand everything, and we as parents can talk to our children about everything that's happening. We can explain, I don't know, like what dad did or mom did or family members, we can just put this huge heavy weight of an adult kind of stuff, the relationship also to people who are very close as well, right? For the child, kind of on their shoulders, and think that they understand.
Yeah. And there has to be rules of engagement when you end a relationship. And so one of the main rules that I have for all couples who come and they're doing the separation process is you cannot talk bad about the other person to your children. That's no matter what that person has done or said, you cannot speak badly about their parent, because children love both parties, right?
Yeah.
And so they shouldn't have the responsibility of picking a side. You cause harm to your children when you do that. And so the main objective is allowing your children to formulate their own opinion about their parents based on their own experiences with them and not your stuff. And when you step back and allow that to happen, as children grow older, they will formulate their own opinions, right? And I say this because my father struggled with substance abuse. To this day, he still struggles with substance abuse. And during the marriage, he wasn't a good husband to my mother, right? He wasn't a good father to us either, but I was too little to understand that. And I was a daddy's girl, loved everything about daddy. And I had this inner conflict because people would say negative things about my father all the time. And I loved him and I desired to be connected to him. And it was difficult as a child to process all those feelings. And it would have been beneficial if the people around me didn't make statements about him in that way and give me space to grow up, have my own experiences with him, and formulate my own conclusion, so that I can heal and work through it without being told things about him that wasn't helpful as a child. So it's really important for us parents to be mindful of what's the benefit and the consequence of sharing this information with our children.
Yeah. And, it massively resonates for me as well. And, and I just really want to say, that all that anger, pain and all the feelings, sadness, grief, they're so important. But as you said, I think there are other channels to just express, like talk to like a friend of yours, call like a partner names or whatever, just go to the support groups. But I think it's so important to process those feelings in therapy or whatever, right? Everyone would have their kind of own journey, and by no kind of means, suppress that, right? I think it's really that this protection needs to be for children. And I think this is such a kind of major part of actually that belief about divorce being traumatic, right? Because I think very often, and this is, I think, something that a lot of people, grew up thinking that we want to like avoid, we don't want to have a divorce, because if we do get a divorce, then this is going to be this trauma for life for children. So very often then people stay in the relationships, they're unfulfilling, not rewarding, and they're just not happy, right? Because there's this idea of the divorce is much more horrifying than actually, having this relationship. And also there's another polarity, right? Obviously with these numbers, I also see a lot of couples who are actually getting a divorce when something can be resolved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of this polarity where, okay, so now, I want to pack my bags and leave. And I also often see it, and I know that was my coping strategy for many years as a result of, my parents' divorce, that for me, kind of every challenge in the relationship would be, okay, I'm packing my shit and I'm just going, because there's no way because I didn't have that modeling, I didn't have that modeling on how to resolve the conflict.
Definitely. I think you speak to a lot of themes that individuals have to consider in relationships. There is a message that we're giving to our youth and how we navigate relationships. And so the healthier we are, the healthier we role model healthiness to them. And so if we're staying in something that's unhealthy, we're teaching them that you must sacrifice self for sake of others. And that's not necessarily the lesson that we want to give. But then we're also saying that when things are difficult, if we walk away easy, that it's not work, or it's not worth the discord that comes along with relationship. And we have to learn, I don't like any extremes. Like, I feel like we got to be working towards getting towards the middle at all costs. And coexisting with another human is hard. And when we think about intimate relationships, there's usually an easier out for us because we're like, oh, I'm not going to deal with this. But when I think about relationships like with my children, it's difficult to coexist with them sometimes too. But I'm not necessarily going to leave them when it gets hard, right? I'm a twin. So I grew up with a twin sister, and it was difficult sharing space with her too. But I couldn't get rid of her because she was my twin sister. And so for me, growing up in a single parent household, when I get the urge to want to just be like, I'm done because my husband's stressing me out, I think about these other relationships that are hard too. And I wonder why I can't give him the same grace that I tend to give to others whom I love. And I try to work through that. But we are conditioned based on our experiences. And when you share that, your feelings, I connected with that because I grew up in a home with a mother who I witnessed do quite a bit. And so there is this inner conflict constantly where I'm like, I don't have to put up with this. I could do it by myself, right? There is a cost to that too. There's definitely that too. And that's that inner adult work where we all have the responsibility of working through those themes, those thoughts, the things that we've been conditioned to feel based on our childhood experiences. And it's almost our responsibility to do differently for our children, knowing we know about how our experiences work.
Yeah. And I think, one of the things that's just important for me to keep in mind, especially just kind of working with some of the clients who are, I guess, in the middle of that, just thinking of separation or thinking of their ways to repair the relationship. I think, it's also something that no matter what the decision is, right, because everyone is going to make the choice that is there, right, whether it's to stay in the relationship, leave the relationship, or sometimes one side makes a decision to leave the relationship or whatever. I think there are going to be consequences, right, with any kind of experience, right, divorce or not, is going to have an impact on our children. So I think there's that, you know, and I think it's just really not a choice in between kind of a divorce or not a divorce. It's really a choice on what relationships we have, right? As you've said, there could be so much damage done outside of the divorce. And I think it's really kind of sometimes what I see is that there's so many opportunities to improve inside, you know, and just really what we want, right, to kind of show to our children is that ultimately we want them to be happy. But if we do want them to be happy, we also need to model that, you know, we need to model how to make choices that are going to be good for us, and recognizing and responding to the needs that we have, including those needs in the relationships.
Definitely. And that need for that self-awareness piece, like the part that you play in it and these relationships, where are these desires and these needs coming from?
Yeah.
What are the benefits and the cost of the choices that we're making along the way?
So what would you say kind of, you know, for some of the kind of people who are going to be watching and, you know, and they might be kind of in the middle of separation or divorce, what would you say are kind of the most important things to consider when it comes to how can we make sure that it's less traumatic for our children?
Well, one thing, you have to do some individual self-reflection about what caused this relationship breakdown, what boundaries do I need to put in place as we transition to the different role. And then you have to communicate that with your partner. So you need to be clear. An example would be, if I worked with couples in the past where there were very little boundaries and the wife felt like she was walked all over and she was just done and she didn't want to do it anymore, right? And so she knew that past this relationship, in our co-parenting relationship, you will have to respect my boundaries. And she was able to verbalize and give clear examples about what that looked like so that they could co-parent in a better way. And then they were able to communicate and develop not necessarily a friendship, but a fondness for each other. And they both communicated to the children that we still love you, right? And we're still committed to doing our very best to helping you work through this collectively together. We're just going to do it differently. We won't be under the same household. So despite us living into two different homes, we still have a collective responsibility to help you work through this, and we're committed to doing that together. A couple other things that help couples is if you're raising children in separate homes, having similar expectations in homes. So that kids won't say, well, dad lets me eat whatever I want, right? And so I'm going to go to daddy's house because I could do whatever I want over there. And then mom is the person that's left to set all the rules and expectations. And so one of the suggestions I give early on is, how can we make it as similar as possible in both houses so that they have that ability to move fluid, but it not be compare between two people, right? Not speaking negatively is another big one. And I talked about that earlier. Staying in your lane and checking in with each other about new relationships, right? So one of the big things that you have to accept when you walk away from your partner is there's a chance that they may partner with someone else, and your children will have the capacity to be connected with those people. And you have to trust that you picked a good enough mom or dad to make good choices about who they would have around your children, because you can't control that part anymore. And that's how that goes.
Yeah, and I think this is also, you know, that part of grieving, you know, that we just touched upon, you know, that just really realizing that there is always going to be that part of your child's life, right? That you're not necessarily going to have any access to, or you're not going to know much about, or you're not going to control. And I think for a lot of people, there's a really big part of, just that grief, that anger, and sometimes that becomes really difficult to process, especially if one of the partners is still more kind of emotionally involved than another. And I also just wanted to tell you about the point that you've made about making sure that there's kind of some similarity when it comes to rules. That I think that part is also so challenging, because especially when like one parent spends more time, so children can live with that, and then another parent becomes that kind of fun parent, right? Usually the parent who is like indulging children more, or they're more permissive, and that also creates a lot of internal conflict that we were talking about. Because actually, as a child who had that different approaches in two homes, that is a huge part of just like thinking, where's this structure? Because kids need structure to feel safe. And actually those completely different permissions, rules, those kind of ideas around what's allowed, what's not allowed, they're really contributing to the part of the divorce that actually can become a big source of. So I know that some parents actually might feel guilty, or they might kind of feel that this is how they're keeping the connection. But in reality, it does create more harm than actually ensuring that you stay connected with a child.
Definitely. It requires this ability for the adults in the relationship to really be mindful of, am I making choices based on my own stuff?
Mm-hmm.
Am I making choices based on what's best for my children? And a lot of times when we're making choices that are not as helpful, that's our stuff. Because we're feeling guilt because we're not connected, so we're buying them things, right? That's your stuff. That's not helpful to them. And so you got to think about, where is this behavior coming from? Is it based on me wanting to do what's best for my children, or is it based on me wanting to meet a need that I have for myself?
Yeah. And especially I think, during like major life transitions, and I think for every party, in the process of the divorce or separation, it's all about lack of certainty, right? There's no clarity. There's so many questions. And I think in that moment of time, really the need for everyone is just to have some sense of support, stability, security, whatever the source of that. But, where we as adults can actually find various ways, right? I think for our children, we are the only sources of that security and stability in that, especially really just challenging time where every day can be different. And I think this is really something to keep in mind, that they might not really need anything else, but just knowing that you're showing up, you're there. And throughout all this mess, which is going to be there probably, because I think theoretically we know how to do it, right? What you are saying theoretically can sound amazing, and I'm sure there are couples who are going to do it, right? Who are going to have an awareness and willingness to do that. And there are going to be a lot of couples who are going to have this messy, horrible kind of divorce that is going to be quite ugly, right? And I think there are always going to be ways to repair, to repair, and just to go back and perhaps have some of those conversations you're talking about, or do some of the things you're talking about, even in the moment you're so swallowed by this intense emotions that you didn't have a capacity for any of that.
Mm-hmm. Indeed. And even in messy divorces, if both parties can't show up to make good choices, then you have to work to be the person to do that then. And you just got to make the individual commitment that despite the actions and behaviors of my ex, I'm going to do what's best for my children. And
Yeah.
that has to be your focus until hopeful, because I'm very hopeful that the other party will eventually show up and see that it's beneficial to do what's best for the kids. But if the kid has one parent that's showing up for them, that is enough to help them.
Yeah.
They just need one. And so if both parties can't do it, commit to being that one. I only had one show up for me, and it was enough. And then it's really important to connect your children to healthy versions of healthy relationships too. And I want to make sure that I say that today because it was paramount in my ability to have a healthy relationship. My mom made sure that we witnessed healthiness from other couples. If she wasn't able to give it to us, I saw it with my grandparents. I saw it with my aunt and uncles. She connected me with people who had healthiness so that I could pull from these examples of people to see that this thing is possible.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm completely just so important. Yeah. Yeah. That's modeling, because I think, children don't have the idea of what is normal, right? When they're raised in a family, they think this is normal. They don't have experiences like us. They can't have this capacity to compare. Their normal is what is modeled. And I really hear that, just giving them an opportunity to really being able to have a choice to actually decide that this might be the relationship that I want to have, as opposed to thinking this is what all relationships are like, right? Because this is really what happens when we're kind of when they're raised in a family that is going through certain challenges, and divorce is only one of them. But again, every event is going to have an impact. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And just I really hope that with some of the things that we've discussed, some people are going to be able to get some ideas, or perhaps just really even validation or recognition for what they're going through. And also we are going to put Danielle's website and contact details. So if you do kind of have any questions, we're going to put your website. And perhaps if anyone, wants to get in touch with you, hopefully, and if they will benefit from some support, right, hopefully they will get in touch. And also, if you have any questions, please comment, give us your feedback, kind of share your experiences with divorce, or what do you think was helpful for you to move through this transition. And subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for sharing today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I appreciate you giving me this space to talk about this topic, because it's really important that individuals know that there can be life after, and it can be healthiness for all parties, your kids and you too.